From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today during his weekly grain market segment, K-State's Dan O'Brien will discuss the unusually strong price basis levels for grain, sorghum, and corn at Kansas delivery points right now, as well as favorable basis for wheat and soybeans. Also today, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz advises you wheat growers on phosphorus and low pH management for winter wheat to be sown this fall. He's saying to soil test for phosphorus and lime needs now so that preparations can be made to address any deficiencies. And further ahead, K-State's Mary Knapp with her weekly stint on Kansas agricultural weather. All that and more directly ahead on this Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, once more from the campus of Kansas State University, and thanks for being along with us. In the grain trades now, some intriguing things afoot in local grain basis around Kansas. That is among the things that we will take up now with K-State Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien, along with us from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. Before we get into that angle, though, Dan, rather uneventful week in grain futures, very little movement in a general sense.
A lot of news, but not much movement. Early part of this week, a lot of news about Chinese purchases of corn and, record one-day purchases, first doing it once and then following up again. And not just corn, but other commodities. In fact, when you look at where these numbers were for forward purchases in particular, a week ago and compare it to this week, each of those quantities jumped appreciably, and not just by a few million bushels, by 10, 20 million bushels a shot or more for sure. So interesting. And Eric, as you and I have talked about in the past, China has some major flooding issues, and they've got that Three Gorges Dam, which they're letting water out at a full open gates situation. We had heard that these floods and potentially more, even if these aren't the major corn growing areas or crop growing areas in the nation over there, still there'd be a lot of disruption of logistics and shipments and rail cars and railroads and all that. And it kind of like we've experienced here in the U.S. last year. So you'd have a situation where they're getting supplies from external sources to bypass some of the worries, the problems they already have, potentially worse in the interior of that country. So we certainly do not wish that type of flooding on any group of people, on any country. So, you hope that dam holds and they don't have any more problems than they already have. But when you see these actions that are occurring now in our markets and some public reports of really great basis for feed grains and even rumors of much better than that, we just don't happen to be catching it publicly in these reportings. If this really comes about, then this is an unexpected issue in the markets. The futures are not reflecting it. Right. You look at yesterday's closes, D's corn, $3.35. November futures, $9, a little bit stronger, but that's not 10, 11, 12 bucks. September, $4.41, down about a dime. So here we have a situation where we have issues happening in other parts of the world. The futures are resolute and not reflecting them yet. But if there's action on this, as we see it in Kansas, it's probably in the basis. And we do have some, you don't want to just use hyperbole to excess, but we have some very strong basis levels for these grains around the state of Kansas, and particularly for, grain sorghum especially, but also for corn and some pretty strong wheat basis. Soybeans, some pretty good basis bids in the central part of the state, out to the west, farther away from the export main flow of that, not so much, just kind of regular. But looking across this landscape, I think as we talk about marketing strategies for farmers in Kansas, it's not so much futures based right now, but I think the opportunities they're looking at are really in terms of basis bids and basis transportation and all of that type of stuff.
Well, let's dig right into that and lend some specifics to those basis trends that you're seeing and what's driving those basis levels.
Well, I think the first thing you look at for feed grains is to the ethanol plant bids. And we in Kansas, with reported bids of 342.5 to 367.5 at the ethanol plants, those are basis bids of 15 to 40 cents over September futures. And that combination is the best almost by far in the whole United States. So what comes close is Indiana at 3 over to 35 over, Ohio at 5 to 25 over. Incidentally, areas that are having real concerns about dry conditions right now. Interesting in Iowa, where about the western 2/3 of Iowa is pretty dry right now, and their best basis bids are 8 to 15 under. So if that drought intensifies there, and again, where are a lot of the ethanol plants in the United States located at? Well, they're right there in western 2/3 of Iowa, particularly northwest, north central, and that's where it's dry. So we'll be watching that. So you start with basis bids of 15 to 40 over for corn. For grain sorghum, basis bids at 10 over at the plants, and just kind of indicative of what's going on in that feed grain market. When you look at cash bids for grain sorghum at elevators, and many of them export oriented, that 10 over, that's just one of the bids. One of them, that's to consider. There are 15, 20, 25 cent over bids. So to me, that's indicative of exports still being a big issue driving what's happening on grain sorghum. For corn, we still see, particularly get into eastern Kansas, you've got bids 2 under, 6 under at Wellington, Ark City, 5 over, 1 over, pretty decent bids. You get out to western Kansas and, Dodge City's 10 over, Garden City 10 to 15 over, Scott City 10 over, 15 over at Sublet, Ulysses, Syracuse 7 over. So those bids are pretty strong bids. But again, the ethanol plant bids of 15 to 40 are just that much stronger. And I think that's indicative of where the strength is coming from. And on grain sorghum, it's export driven. There are other factors out there. Ethanol, for sure, one of them, but probably some exports coming into play also for the corn basis bids that are strong.
So that, may be what's pushing those feed grain basis bids. What about the basis trends for soybeans? You also hinted that they're doing quite fine right now.
Well, they're in the western part of the state. Again, going off of yesterday's USDA, Western Kansas grain markets, Central Kansas markets. And by the way, here's a USDA Ag Marketing Service reports. If you wonder where to get the best picture of what's going on in the state, going to the Ag Markets, USDA Ag Market Service, and there they are, and tremendous sources. Anyway, western part of the state for soybeans, best bids for soybeans in protection, again, basis August, 80 under, 75 under at Ulysses. That's a bid basis out there to November. So those bids are just kind of so-so. Again, they've certainly been worse in western Kansas, but for soybeans in the central part of the state, at Atkinson and Topeka, 32 under. That's sure worthwhile to look at. And you look at Salina, 42, 45 under. Again, you've got some different months coming in that they're going basis. Some basis August, some September. So that's my point. My point is that given that we've had really wide basis bids for soybeans in the not too distant past, you come to the central part of the state, it looks to be some decent soybean basis bids. I would say in our notes that we have on Ag Manager, tried to look at the 6 different sections of the state: Northwest, Southwest, and North Central, South Central, Northeast, Southeast, and pick out major terminal centers in each of those and to show charts of them. And again, you look at those grain sorghum bids, unbelievable. They're 50 cents plus better than any place else. And what looks weakest is Southeast Kansas, and it's only because it's 20 cents better than everything else we've had. Corn looking pretty good too, not quite the moonshot improvement that you see for sorghum, but again, you get to the western part of the state, particularly Northwest, unbelievably strong basis bids for corn and very strong for Garden City, et cetera. we should talk about, if we can talk about wheat basis
bids,
by all
means,
I'd like
yes.
to do that too.
And we have seen some export business for wheat, which has to be part of this picture, doesn't it?
Well, it does. Export shipments, it's harvest, post-harvest for hard red. We had, for the week ending July 16th, 19.4 million bushels of export business. Need a pace of 18.3 to beat the USDA's projections. Well, you kind of crow in victory when you actually beat what you need for what the USDA says, because they tend to be pretty conservative. Anyway, that plus, we're 7 weeks into this current marketing year for U.S. wheat. Excuse me, that 19.4 was for all U.S. wheat. For hard red, 11.2 million bushels, and we need a pace of 2.7 to meet the USDA's projections. So what a week. So for a hard red winter wheat, we're 30% of the way in terms of forward purchases to the USDA's projection of 385 million bushels, and we're only 7 weeks in, about 14% of the way there. So strong start, really strong start for hard red, and it's reflected in pretty good basis bids, generally not the best basis bids we've seen since and including 2016, except for Southeast. This time it is by far the best. So Southeast is kind of a independent operator, I guess, but pretty strong basis for hard red as well here in Kansas. And so again, with the futures just sort of doing what they're doing, and large positions in aggregate on the part of traders and in the futures, I understand they're dealing with risk and uncertainty as they do. But when you come out to the country and you have to move grain or procure it, then you're seeing some different things happening out here, especially in these different corners of Kansas. And frankly, for people watching the grain market, if they're watching the futures, they might be falling asleep. But man, if they're watching basis, their alert is all get out.
The latest on those, along with everything else that Dan has talked about today, fully captured in his notes that are now posted on agmanager.info. Thanks for the input, Dan, and next Friday we'll do it once again.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension, grain market economist, on this part of Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Agriculture Today is back now, and we'll talk crop nutrient management on this segment as we've caught up once again with Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And Dorivar, we're just off another wheat production season here in Kansas, and we want to look ahead to the next wheat planting, things producers can do ahead of planting time. When we look back at this wheat harvest just passed, can we learn anything about our nutrient management from the results of that harvest, do you think?
Yes, Eric. This year we have some studies that we have multiple year studies looking at things like phosphorus and pH. We have some very good results, and we learn a lot of things. And of course, in the case of these two factors of soil pH and phosphorus, there are things that typically needs to be planned ahead. Specifically, we're talking about pH in particular. If we have the need to do some corrections, some lime application, this is a process that will need soil sampling, making that decision, and of course, enough time for that lime application also to basically react in the soil and correct that low pH issues that we may have ahead of planting. So it is something that we need to be thinking about right now. On the other hand, phosphorus is a similar situation. We do need to do soil testing early on and make decisions whether or not we need to make some type of corrections ahead of planting. And these are, again, two studies that we have ongoing in the field. In the case of phosphorus, we are looking at things like placement and rates of application, especially with low testing soil situation. And again, there are many considerations there that has to do with soil test levels, that has to do even with planting dates, where, again, when we have issues of late planted wheat, for example, some challenges, low temperature in the fall, things like that will also have an influence, particularly for phosphorus, but also pH can have an effect on how well that crop is developing in the fall.
Does the crop itself allow any indications of a phosphorus deficiency or a lime deficiency, a low pH issue? In other words, do yields from a given part of the field tip one off as to needs for either of those?
Yes, and in the case of these two, phosphorus and pH, it's a little bit more difficult sometimes to notice deficiency symptoms. It's not like in the case of nitrogen or sulfur, where we do see yellow plants out there and so on. We don't tend to see that type of symptoms very evident in the field. So that's one of the challenges. So oftentimes what we tend to see in the case of low pH problems or low phosphorus is we do tend to see very poor growth in that crop. And it's something that we tend to see more in the fall, because these two factors are going to be key for root development and tiller formation in the fall, which again ultimately will be contributing to yields in the spring. But again, these are key factors that we tend to see in the fall. In the case of pH, for example, if we do have low pH and we do have some aluminum toxicity problems, then the roots are going to be limited. And this tends to translate into just generally poor growth, maybe some symptoms that will be more similar to drought stress, just because that root system is basically not developing. And in the case of phosphorus, it's a somewhat similar situation. Again, root development will tend to be limited, and of course, fewer tillers that we will see in the fall. But again, besides that, if we don't have a comparison, a way to compare that in the field, sometimes we don't see it. And so that's one of the challenges. So really, we need to start here with soil testing and evaluate what are the levels of these of phosphorus and pH, and do we need to make some type of correction before planting.
Again, as you said, liming can start any time if one has a low pH. What about that phosphorus application, though? And as far as its timing, does it go on ahead of planting, at planting? What's the best strategy there?
Yes, obviously this is an immobile nutrient in the soil, so timing is really a key factor here, timing and placement as well for winter wheat. And in the case of phosphorus, because it is an immobile nutrient, it's something that we need to apply before planting, enough time essentially for that phosphorus to interact with the soil and basically be available to the root system. So that's a key factor. Again, we need to do that ahead of planting. In many cases, many producers may be putting most of the phosphorus or even 100% of the phosphorus with the drill at planting time. That's also another excellent option. The phosphorus obviously will be available in close proximity to the root system. And it's actually a system that tends to work very well in winter wheat. I know many producers that have the capability with earth seeders and so on to apply dry fertilizer phosphorus with the seed. That typically tends to be a very efficient system because, again, of that proximity. The other advantage of that as well is that we are able to put higher rates of fertilizer in the case of winter wheat. We're talking more narrow rows, so we can typically put 100% of the phosphorus without any issues in terms of seedling damage. This is something different when we're talking about row crops. So in the case of wheat, of course, we can put 100% of the phosphorus fertilizer at planting time. So it can be a very, very efficient system. In fact, in what we saw this past season, that was perhaps one of the main results, take-home messages from this past season, comparing both broadcast and in-furrow application of phosphorus, especially in those situations where we planted wheat maybe a little bit later. We were not able to get on time in the fall, and that phosphorus placement really make a difference in that kind of situation. Because again, any access to phosphorus to that plant will again contribute to root growth and tiller development, which is critical if we are planting late. Of course, we don't have enough time for that tiller development. So any small advantage we can provide to that crop translated ultimately into yields. Another factor there also, we mentioned soil testing, and in the case of wheat, it's a crop that I will consider one of the most responsive crops that we grow in Kansas to phosphorus. So we have to make sure and maintain the soil testing phosphorus to 20 part per million or higher. really for that crop. Other crops, say for example, soybean tends to be more flexible, can grow on phosphorus, residual fertility from other crops, and so on. But winter wheat will definitely be your more responsive crop. So I'd also know many cases where situations where maybe a producer have a rotation, wheat in the rotation, a good time to maybe load a little bit higher rates of phosphorus will be ahead of wheat because, again, of that nice response. And again, any residual phosphorus will be available for the following crop. So that's another approach that we can definitely consider also for wheat.
In as far as addressing that low pH situation and thinking about application, timing, and rates for that lime, what do you have to offer there, Dorivar?
Eric, yes, this will be also a situation where we need to be thinking ahead. And of course, we really need to apply that lime ideally a couple months before planting to provide basically enough time for that lime to react. A few key things that we need to think about here, especially we have soil test results coming back with pH below 5.5, and especially we start to see some aluminum in solution, which we can actually request a soil testing lab to provide aluminum tests as well. If it is getting above 25 parts per million for aluminum, we typically will start to see some issues with aluminum toxicity and ultimately affecting yields. So keeping that in mind, that a pH of 5.5 and aluminum of 25 and higher, that will be problematic. So we really need to be thinking about, in that case, about lime application. Once we get to that level, we'll tend to see very consistent yield benefits. And of course, one thing that we have to think about lime is that we tend to think about the yield response of the next crop. However, this is really a long-term benefit. We typically took in multiple years that we're going to be getting from that lime application. In most soils, we're talking 5 to up to 10 years before we need to do anything else when it comes to pH. So we need to keep that in mind as well as we're thinking about that yield benefit and return to investment. We're really talking about multiple crops that will benefit from that lime application. So definitely something that we need to be thinking about. If we're not able to do any lime applications, we have other options as well, more of a short-term fix. And of course, we have variety selections. We can look at some varieties that will do better in lower pH. That's one way to mitigate the problem. Also, we do tend to see a good benefit from in-furrow phosphorus application. That's another situation where if we do have low pH, putting some phosphorus in-furrow can also help to promote a little bit better root growth and maybe help that crop basically to grow out of that aluminum toxicity issue. So, but again, these are really more of a short-term fix when it comes to low pH.
More than plenty to think about here, but once more, it all begins with a baseline of information, and that is in the form of that soil test. So producers need to be taking that very soon now, as we'll be looking in some parts of Kansas at wheat planting in just a couple of months from now or less. Dorivar, thanks for imparting these thoughts. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
He's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Some pre-plant considerations on nutrient management for that next winter wheat stand on Agriculture Today. Now we'll stand aside for a few moments, and when we return, we'll have today's agricultural news headlines for you. The Kansas Wheat Scoop, likewise, where you'll hear more about a major campaign for funding wheat research. And once again, Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather. Still ahead.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and next up for you, today's agricultural news headlines. These courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the Kansas Department of Agriculture has now identified positive cases of vesicular stomatitis virus, or VSV, in 20 counties in Kansas. The KDA's Division of Animal Health continues to respond to the outbreak that began in south-central Kansas last month. It's now expanded its reach to the north and to the east. Nearly 90 premises have tested positive for VSV in these counties: Allen, Bourbon, Butler, Chase, Cherokee, Coffee, Cowley, Elk, Greenwood, Labette, Lyon, Marion, Miami, Montgomery, Morris, Neosho, Sedgwick, Sumner, Wilson, and Woodson counties now. In addition, the KDA is awaiting laboratory results from symptomatic animals in other counties as the outbreak continues to spread. Now, all premises with confirmed cases of VSV in horses and cattle have been quarantined. Additionally, any premises with animals showing clinical signs consistent with VSV are placed on quarantine. More than 90 again currently under quarantine. Those quarantines last for 14 days. They're not lifted until a veterinarian has examined all susceptible animals on the premises, and over 90 have been released from quarantine at the same time. Kansas Animal Health Commissioner Justin Smith reminds you, livestock owners, you can help slow the spread of the virus by taking steps to limit exposure to insects, which are the primary source of infection, and by keeping your animals separate from other animals which may be infected, and monitor for symptoms of VSV. Call your veterinarian if you see anything of concern. As for those symptoms in horses, VSV typically characterized by lesions on the muzzle, lips, ears, the coronary bands, or the abdomen. Other clinical signs: fever and the formation of blister-like lesions in the mouth. Affected animals may be refusing to eat and drink. That'll lead to weight loss, and VSV can be painful for infected animals, costly to the owners likewise. The primary way it's transmitted from biting insects like black flies, sand flies, and midges. So robust measures to reduce flies and other insects where animals are housed are encouraged. And it can also be spread by nose-to-nose contact. It usually runs its course from 5 to 7 days, but it can take up to an additional 7 days for the infected animal to recover from the symptoms, and there are no approved vaccines for VSV. More information about the virus can be found at this website, agriculture.ks.gov/VSV, agriculture.ks.gov/VSV. And Senate Agriculture Committee Chairman John Hoeven of North Dakota and Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota both have told the Hagstrom Report the Senate Republican coronavirus aid package now in development contains $20 billion in additional aid for farmers to go along with the $14 billion in CCC authority that became available earlier this month under the CARES Act. The USDA currently has been spending as much as $16.5 billion on the coronavirus food assistance program, but the USDA does have $14 billion in Commodity Credit Corporation authority that became available for the department to use at the beginning of July. Several agricultural industries have been lobbying Congress for more direct aid, including pork producers who want indemnity for euthanizing animals, and the ethanol industry, which has been shut out of direct aid. Negotiations on the legislation have stalled in the Senate over several issues, including how to address unemployment benefits, as the $600 weekly checks from the government are expiring at the end of July. The Republican senators also rejected a demand from the president for a payroll tax cut. They're opting instead to send another round of checks directly to taxpayers. This delay is pushing any legislation until at least this coming Monday, according to various reports. Well, a multi-million-dollar fundraising campaign in support of advanced wheat research in Kansas recently reached an important milestone. It's on pace to reach its target by the end of next year and is looking for supporters to make that happen. Marcia Boswell has more on that on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
The Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation announced on July 17th that its Fields Forward research fundraising campaign has surpassed the $2 million mark toward its goal of $4 million by the end of 2021. Led by the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation, the Fields Forward campaign was launched in January of 2019. According to Ron Supis, chair of the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation, the continued success of the Fields Forward campaign is a credit to the generosity and commitment to wheat research by all segments of the wheat industry. We sincerely thank our donors who have invested in the future of wheat research through the next several decades. The lead donors who got the campaign to the halfway mark were recognized during an online campaign kickoff event. The major contribution to the campaign so far was a $1 million gift from the Veneer family. Other lead donors include the Mole Family Foundation with a gift of $300,000, MKC with a gift of $150,000, Great Plains Analytical Laboratory, Cereal Ingredients Inc., and Robert Hatch with a gift of $100,000, and $50,000 gifts from Comark Equity Exchange, Skyland Grain, Graincraft, and ProValue Insurance. Funds raised through the campaign will be used for 3 different purposes. Fields of research, funding ongoing wheat research programs that improve the profitability of farmers while improving the quality of wheat for end use. Fields of study, keeping a full pipeline of future research talent by supporting students and technicians in research fields essential to wheat. And fields of the future, building funds for the long-term support of wheat research while maintaining the level of technology and facilities necessary to sustain that work. The campaign accepts many types of gifts to support wheat research, including cash, stock transfers, donations of grain, and deferred gifts such as will bequests. The Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation was established in 2011 as the official fundraising organization for the Kansas Wheat Commission. The foundation works to raise private dollars to combine with public funds for the advancement of wheat research, including the accelerated release of wheat varieties. The KWC Research Foundation is a separate, independent entity chartered by the state of Kansas as a 501c3 nonprofit research corporation. While the wheat checkoff is paid only by farmers, the foundation allows private individuals in all segments of the wheat industry to support wheat research through tax-deductible gifts. Complete campaign details and the online kickoff event video can be found at fieldsforward.org. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and we'll be back after this. This is Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Closing out this Agriculture Today, it's our look at Kansas agricultural weather with Mary Knapp along with us, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. And let's start with this, Mary. Unanticipated rainfall around Kansas this week.
Right. When we look at the week ending on Tuesday, which is the time frame that goes into the U.S. Drought Monitor, we were wetter than normal across the state, almost 1.5 times the normal rainfall for the state. Not surprisingly, it wasn't evenly distributed across the region. There were some areas that got less than what they usually get. But kind of noteworthy was the Southwest was on the receiving end for a change. Didn't make it all the way to the Colorado border, but still they had fairly decent rains just to the east of the border. And the Southwest Division actually came out on top as the wettest division in the state for the week, which is not very common. They had over 2 times their normal weekly rainfall in that region, which is why there was some reduction in the drought. We still have extreme drought, again, along the Kansas-Colorado border, but the area of coverage shrank a little bit, and as you go further east in the state, there was some improvement in that southwest corner.
But we're talking 2 to 3 inches of rain in those areas, something along that line?
We were talking 2 inches plus in that area, and again, more than one location that had that amount. There were those that missed out, but it was, again, a much more widespread event than we've seen in quite some time. So very, very welcome rains in that region with some cooler temperatures to go along with it. On the other side of the coin and the other side of the state, the Southeast Division missed out on most of it. They did get a little rain, but that is an area of the state that typically sees the most rain. They averaged about a third of what they would normally see for the week, and that stretched up into east central Kansas as well. So it's no surprise that that is the area where we saw the greatest expansion in drought. And so a lot that had been abnormally dry fell into moderate drought with that continuation of the dryness in that region. The heaviest rain, aside from that southwest division, was a pocket of rain along the Missouri-Kansas border in northeastern Kansas. Donovan, Brown County areas, there were some places that saw in excess of 8 inches of rain. So that created a little bit of problem with flooding of some fields, but put an end to any drought expansion in that region. In the central part of the state, from Manhattan to Ellsworth to Hayes, it was more of a beneficial rain, and that was, again, very welcome for dryland crops that are in a high demand period at this time.
The past few days, though, have been warm to hot, not only during the day but during the nighttime, and that has raised concerns about corn pollination.
Right, and that really, we can go back to last week for that, where we were really concerned with it. I looked at the temperatures from the 12th through the 19th, which corresponds to the time period that the National Ag Statistics Service rates the different commodities. At the beginning of that period, we had about 40% of the corn that was tasseling. By the 19th, we were over 60% that had been tasseling. That, again, is a time period where the crop is particularly vulnerable to elevated temperatures. In the eastern part of the state, that 7-day period had 5 days where the temperatures never dropped below 70. Very stressful for the crop at that point. We saw 100-degree readings across all but the eastern divisions, and those were up in the 90s. Those are the measured air temperature. Given those high dew points and those high nighttime temperatures, heat index values were very, very oppressive. Yesterday here in Manhattan, our temperatures got up to about 88, 89. Our heat index values were pushing 100. And again, with the rains that we've seen in the last couple of weeks, we're going to see those heat index values and those humidity levels continue to be on the high side.
Well, by the sound of it, Mary, another weekend of heat. And then once we get into next week, a cool down forthcoming?
Well, it looks like we're going to have another disturbance come through towards the end of the weekend, which will bring, again, this chance for rain, and on the backside of that, a cool down in the temperatures. So over the weekend, we're going to see some heat, but certainly not any record-setting kind of values. What we're watching is what's happening with the Gulf of Mexico. There are a number of disturbances going there. Most of that looks like it's going to stay in the southern part, hitting Mexico, maybe into southern Texas, but that also tends to invigorate and curve up into the west, and that could bring, again, another chance for showers as we go into the next 6 to 10 days. And indeed, the next 6 to 10 days favors wetter than normal conditions across the state. When you have that rainfall, the cloud cover, you typically have cooler temperatures, and that is indeed what they're projecting. They're looking at slight chance for cooler and wetter for the next 10 days, then shifting back into a more late summer pattern of warmer and drier. For the quantitative precip outlook, which is what gives us an indication of how much moisture we expect to squeeze out with the system, We're looking generous rains across the entire state with a chance of that 7-day total in excess of 3/4 of an inch across the region, with some areas seeing as much as 1 3/4 inches. Typical rainfall for the last week in July, the first week in August, would be somewhere between 7/10 and 9/10 of an inch. So if we can get that, it would be on the beneficial side.
It would be timely for many a row crop stand out there. And Mary, as always, thanks for the input, and we'll catch up with you again next Friday.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. That will do it for today's edition. Bidding you a good weekend, Eric Atkinson, thanking you for joining us for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.